Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord. I'm James Carden. I'm very pleased to welcome Paul Robinson to the Zoomcast today. Paul has a doctorate in modern history from the University of Oxford. He teaches at the University of Ottawa. Prior to his graduate studies, he served as a regular officer in the British Army Intelligence Corps from 1989 to 1994, and then as a reserve officer in the Canadian Forces from 94 to 96. He's published many books and is widely read on military and Russian affairs. He serves with me on the board of the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy, and he writes I can only describe it as the indispensable blog called Irrationality, which you can find at irrationality@wordpress.com. So Paul, before we get to the real heavy lifting, there's something that I've always wanted to ask you, and I don't know if I have because we've met a few times. How did you come up with the name Irrationality for the blog? It's really quite good.
Actually, my wife suggested it. I was looking at a name of the blog, so I wanted something which talked about Russia. But I also, another theme I've been interested in is like the sort of what you might call irrational direction of Western foreign policy, right? And the way that we seem incapable of following reason, both in setting of goals and in applying means in such ways to achieve those goals. So I wanted something which talked about irrationality and something which talked about Russia. And so she came up with irrationality. So which combines the two into one. So that's how that happened. So I claim no credit for
that. Which is probably a good idea. I guess, it was kind of a prescient name because you were writing the blog long before our descent into, Russiagate, Trump-Russia madness, right? When did you begin the blog?
It was about 2014, I think. So it was around the time when the Ukrainian war started, and there were a couple of reasons which sort of caused me to go blogging. I mean, the first was that it became clear to me that more and more people were moving to the internet, and that's where you needed to be. The second was that I used to write a lot of op-eds for places like The Spectator and the Ottawa Citizen newspaper, and it was becoming harder and harder to get a place. And also they stopped paying. And at that point I thought, well,
being a continuing theme in my business.
Yeah, I mean, it was time to give the mainstream media a bit of a finger at that point. So that's what I did.
So right now we're talking on a Monday afternoon, the 16th, and Afghanistan is dominating the headlines. I'm doing something which I never normally do. I have CNN on in the background, kind of following events. And, I have to say that, the events as they're unfolding, they're obviously tragic, but they're hardly surprising. And I'd like you to kind of take us through, how do we get here? How do we get to this point? You yourself have been warning that this was the likely outcome for many years. How did we end up in the situation that we are currently in? And please feel free to go back to 1979 if you want to, but you can keep it more up to date.
Yeah, well, we've ended up in a remarkable situation where we're making the Soviets look really good.
Yeah.
I mean, truly that is the case. And it's something that as someone who spent some time in the Soviet Union as a student, I never imagined could be the case. But really, Soviets look like ballet geniuses compared to us. They really do. I think a lot of this has to do with the inherent problems which arise out of client-patron relationships and aid, over-dependence on aid. So if you're a state which receives the overwhelming bulk of its money from foreign donors, you have no incentive to behave well, or to improve your governance, or to have really to do anything very much, right? Because you don't depend upon your own people or your own people's support, or upon acting honestly or decently towards your people. You just rely on money you get from outside. And of course, if you throw in vast sums of money into an impoverished country like Afghanistan, of course the result is corruption. And you know, we complained all these years about these people are so corrupt, we've got to do something about it, we've got to improve governance. And without ever really thinking that maybe the reason they're so corrupt is not because there's something inherently wrong about Afghans or something. The Taliban have a reputation for not being corrupt. It's because of what we're doing and the vast sums of money which we pour in. Now, clearly in this kind of client-patron relationship, the patron can threaten to withdraw the aid if the client doesn't behave himself, but at that point the client just calls the patron's bluff. Because really the reason we get into the situation is because the United States primarily, but also to some degree its allies, in pursuit of some external enemy, allies itself with somebody or other. And then it feels that its prestige, its reputation is wrapped up with the continued survival of its ally. And if the ally knows that, right, then the ally can really basically do whatever he likes, because he can just call the Americans bluff and say, you want me to behave better? Okay, go away. We don't think you're going to, right? And so there's very little incentive for them to behave well. So although you might imagine that the patron is in charge of the client, very often really the client's the one pulling the strings, right?
This is a familiar story to me. It reminds me of a so-called ally that we cultivated and supported in Georgia in and around 2008. Right, that we have a habit of doing that, of empowering or having these people like Saakashvili believe they are empowered to act very stupidly.
Yes, and then of course you can go way back to the South Vietnamese government where the same phenomenon revealed itself, and I think you can see some degree of this happening in Ukraine as well, where you know the Ukrainian government has no incentive to do what really needs to be done to end the war there, which is, you know, abide by the what terms which are in the Minsk agreement, which means actually negotiate with the rebel provinces, offer them some sort of amnesty and autonomy. But as long as the Americans are supporting them, you know, really unconditionally, they can go on behaving badly, right? And they know no one's going to do anything about it. So you have what I think is I mean, you can extend this generally to you know, studies of aid dependency and all the negative phenomena which come from the granting of foreign aid. And I think that, you know, it's in a sense, it's almost the more you try to support someone to make them better govern themselves, the worse they govern themselves, right? I mean, that's unfortunately the sort of phenomenon we have. And so it's no surprise that by you know, backing the Afghan government in these ways for all these many years and turning a blind eye to what were some pretty horrendous practices carried out by Afghan troops, the Afghan police, by local Afghan warlords, because they were our son of a bitch, right? It's hardly surprising that we ended up with a regime no one was willing to fight or die for.
I think, you know, one of the things that you touched upon in your recent, you know, post at a Russianality about the situation in Afghanistan is I think that, you know, some people I was talking to just over the past few days who, you know, aren't necessarily, you know, up on everything that's going on in the world, I think they would be very surprised at the nature of our so-called allies there in Afghanistan, and some of the practices that they have, particularly with regard to pedophilia. And it seems to me that practices like that turn the local population away from our proxies and towards the Taliban. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of insidious nature of our partners over there?
Yeah, well, see, one reason the Taliban came to power the first time around was that the various warlords who were governing Afghanistan before them behaved in all sorts of atrocious ways. So what happens when the Americans drove out the Taliban was that a lot of these criminal elements came back, right? And the cleverer ones among them then allied themselves with the Americans and their allies and became sort of our guys on the ground. and were used by us as a way of maintaining order. But of course, they went back to their old ways of extorting the local people, drug running, and so on and so forth. So, and I described in my recent blog some sort of statements by British officers who were in Helmand province about how basically when NATO went into Helmand province, they were, they thought they were helping the people, but what they were actually doing was acting as an arm of one drug runner against another drug runner, right? You saw this in Kandahar province, where the Canadians allied themselves with a guy called Abdul Razik, who was a very famous sort of drug running warlord. And you mentioned pedophilia. I mean, there were many complaints about this, about how NATO troops knew that their Afghan allies were bringing in boys and things, but they've been told they couldn't do anything about it. Understandably, because if you start using force against your allies, then you end up fighting a civil war against them as well as against the Taliban, which we couldn't manage. On one occasion, I was asked by the Journal of Military Ethics, which is a academic journal, to comment on a piece an American Army officer had written about when his troops had to deal with some Afghan soldiers who'd murdered prisoners, and the officer describes in asking what he'd done about it, and should he complain up the chain of command, should he do something with the Afghans themselves, and in the end you're just left in an impossible situation, like you end up doing nothing, and the Afghans know this, so they carry on behaving this way. So we presented this as we were there defending liberal democracy or whatever, liberal values, educating girls and so on. And there was an element of truth to that. However, when you got down to the local level, you would find that many of the people actually, running the show, who we were defending, were not very pleasant.
And this tends to be a feature, not a bug, of recent American foreign policy. My late friend, Cheryl Sweninger, who died about a year ago, Cheryl founded the New America Foundation, was a brilliant writer and editor. He always remarked upon how it's very troubling how within the past 30 years, the United States and our NATO partners always end up with the most unsavory partners possible. So in Afghanistan, we have those people who we just spoke about. In Syria, we were supporting Islamist terrorists like Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda offshoots. In Ukraine, we've supported neo-Nazi battalions there. And so it kind of, raises some troubling, moral questions about what our interventions ultimately bring about. There's another moral aspect, I think, to what's going on, and I think that this is applicable to our policies in Eastern Europe, and it strikes me as immoral for the United States and our NATO partners to continually overpromise things, and things that we know that ultimately we're not going to follow through on. So in Afghanistan, so today in Politico, there's an anonymous letter from a journalist there who writes as follows. He writes, "We could never have imagined and believed that this would happen. We could never imagine we would be betrayed so badly by the US. The feeling of betrayal, I dedicated my life to American values. There was a lot of promise, a lot of assurance, a lot of talk about values, a lot of talk about progress, about rights, about women's rights, about freedom, about democracy. That all turned out to be hollow." And really, who could argue? But it seems to me that we are making the same mistake in Eastern Europe as well by overpromising, say, NATO ascension to Ukraine and Georgia.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a couple of good points there. I mean, the first thing about backing very unpleasant people, of course, it would matter less if they were at least competent unpleasant people. So Najib,
right? Like Stalin was unpleasant.
Yeah, I suppose that, you could argue at least he sort of got the job done. And Najibullah, who ran Afghanistan when the Soviets left, was not a very pleasant guy, but he was a very competent one, right? We seem to have a knack of allying ourselves with incompetent, nasty people. So that's that tells us something about our judgment. As for all we know, the talk of values and so on, I think, the problem with this, a lot of it is about selling these things to domestic political audiences, right? As is, aid projects and so on. I remember, one of my colleagues who has studied aid projects in Afghanistan, giving us a presentation some years ago now, it must be maybe a decade or so ago now, saying that, which he said, the point of these projects, it's not actually about helping the Afghans, it's about getting a photo opportunity, which you can then put in the newspaper back home, which then gains public support for the military mission, right?
Well, it's just, yeah, I mean, it's the same sort of thing that, Goldman Sachs does in New York City, right? They have a service day. They say that they're going to go up to, Harlem to plant trees, but really all they do is take a photo and then they go out and drink. So it's the same sort of thing, right? I mean, I found it I went to grad school down here for international affairs about 10 years ago. And I always found it sort of vaguely appalling that, a lot of these students really were in it just to get a job at, these so-called aid organizations. They get a free trip over to Afghanistan to work on some project that, would really make no difference, but, they did rather well in doing it. So it's also sort of a, there's sort of we know about the military industrial complex. Well, there's kind of a humanitarian industrial complex as well.
Yes, I think that's true. And the other point you made, I think is very good, is about overpromising, locals. So, I mean, you can see this in the case of Ukraine, for instance, where, it's sort of implied to the Ukrainian, pro-Western elites that, if they tag along with us and they're nasty to the Russians, someday they'll join the EU and NATO. But we all know they won't. I mean, the odds that we'll ever let them in NATO or the EU are infinitesimally small, I believe, right? So we're, encouraging them to take a political line, which is actually rather catastrophic to their country, with promises which we have no intention of actually ever fulfilling. And I think, similar, insinuations were given to Saakashvili before the 2008 war with Russia. It's not that the Americans told him to attack South Ossetia. Apparently, they actually told him not to, but he kind of misunderstood the general support for NATO membership as being a green light.
Right.
So we send, we're very careless about the signals we send. And we don't think we're egging people on, but in fact we are. And we encourage really bad policies.
Yeah, and in his particular case, he never really struck me as the sharpest tool in the shed. And he mistook these, the rhetorical support that people like John McCain and Benjamin Carden and Robert Menendez were giving him on Capitol Hill for support. But, senior American officials like Fiona Hill were telling him not to do it. So, yeah. And we have this problem in the United States where sometimes these people actually take, and it's a very fundamental mistake. You really should never believe what's coming out of the halls of Congress, but sometimes they do. So
and there was some of the thing, I think, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, that he had misinterpreted something the Americans had told him as saying it was okay. They hadn't actually told him it was okay, but he kind of got the message that the Americans didn't care. Right.
That was, I believe that was April Gillespie, the ambassador to Iraq, who maybe inadvertently sent that signal. Of course, then after the war, we gave a similar signal to the Kurds. And the Kurds felt that the United States would support their uprising against the newly defeated Saddam Hussein. And of course, that led to a wholesale slaughter of the Kurds. And so, we have this history of sending mixed signals. And I wonder, in looking at what's unfolding in Afghanistan, um, is it, if we look back over the past 20 or so years, is this sort of the exception or the rule with regard to NATO operations? And it would seem to me that it's reflective of how NATO does business. If you go back to, let's say, 1999 in Kosovo, right? We have a very long history of NATO interventions that actually cause more harm than good.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I think, of course, they've gotten worse as they go along. There was an American theologian, I think he's Walter Wink, I think he was called, who wrote a book about, we talked about the in sort of modern Western society's penchant for violence, and he said that actually, it's the wars which work which are actually the worst, because the fact that one can be said to work is what then encourages all the disasters thereafter. So Kosovo sort of could be said to have worked in the sense that the violence has now stopped. It came at a heavy price because of a massive ethnic cleansing of Serbs, and the creation of something of a gangster state, but at least it's quiet, right? So sort of NATO can paint that one as a success, but of course that then encouraged them to think that we are all powerful, we can crush our enemies, and then that led to the intervention in Afghanistan after the Americans were initially there, and NATO came in I think 2006. Then you have of course you have invasion of Iraq, which isn't NATO, but I think is driven by the same sort of arrogance, and of course the bombing of Libya. Okay, and both the NATO operation and the bombing of Libya have been catastrophic in their consequences. So I'm really not a natural anti-NATO person as a former army officer who, in my youth, was part of NATO forces defending West Germany against the Soviets. It's not my natural position. But when you look at what NATO has actually done in recent years, you have to say it's done far more harm than good. And when you look at NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, I can understand the reasons for it. And if the Baltic states want to join NATO, you could say, well, let them join NATO. But there are consequences to this. And when you move your troops within 100 miles of St. Petersburg, when you can't be surprised if you get some pushback, right? Unfortunately, there's a tendency for us to be very unwilling to consider anybody else's point of view, because we're so wrapped up in the idea that we're the good guys, that if anyone opposes us, they must know that we're the good guys, right? Because we so obviously are. So if they're saying we're the bad guys, it's just because they're lying, because they're the bad guys, right? It's led to one disaster after another.
Yeah, we're only a defensive alliance.
Yeah, well, no Russian believes that. You tell that a Russian, they'll just burst out laughing. I mean, how can you say you're defensive when you haven't defended anywhere ever, right? But you have bombed Yugoslavia, occupied Afghanistan, and destroyed the Libyan government, right? I mean, none of those are defensive operations.
No, not by a long stretch. The person who founded the website that we're on, Stephen F. Cohen, used to like to say that NATO isn't the AARP, right? It's not just some organization that if you want to join, you can join, right? It's a military alliance with very specific, goals. And the problem with an operation, like Kosovo, for instance, it also sort of set a precedent that the Russians then picked up on, right? So they pointed to what they did in Crimea to the precedent set in Kosovo, right?
Yes, that's right.
And then, of course, the other thing with these empty promises to Ukraine is that, the Russians take that very seriously. And, as John Mearsheimer has pointed out, he believes that NATO expansion was the tap root of the Ukrainian war that ignited in 2014.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly, when you look at Ukraine, it means a lot more to the Russians than it means to us, right? So, if
So there are some
if
people.
we push them hard enough, they will hit us back, and I think there's a failure to recognize that. So we're sort of egging people on without actually really having the will to follow it through, whereas the other side does. The other side often has much more will than we do, right?
Yeah, I agree. Well, Paul, as I promised you off camera, we were going to keep this short and painless, and I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights with us. And I really would urge people to check out his blog on a daily basis. It's really one of the best things out there. So, Paul, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, James, for having me on. My pleasure.